We start off year 1500. That's a good starting place because the whole world began interacting with each other. Now, the world history before 1500 is a mosaic. Like you have people living over here, hardly aware of people living here, hardly aware of people living here, people living in isolation. At 1500, they all started coming together. Europeans particularly began sailing. Europeans began sailing across the globe. The persons who led the way were the Portuguese. And you might can guess why by looking at the map. Portugal was on the far western end of Europe. Marco Polo had visited China. All right. China was known to Europeans. It was looked on as being a land of magic. The Europeans were very curious about China, especially after Marco Polo went there, spent a good many years there, and came back and wrote a book about what he had seen in China. And a lot of Europeans read Marco Polo's book, including Christopher Columbus. So Europeans went, well, how can we get to China? Well, between Europe way over here and China way over here, there lived the Muslims, and they blocked Europeans from going to China. Now, the Chinese were not much interested in coming to Europe as far as we know, but the Europeans wanted to go to China. So we had to figure out, the European, how do we get around the Muslim world? So they began to explore around Africa. At the time, nobody knew, did Africa go all the way around the world, or did Africa come to an end somewhere? Now, if they had known their history, they'd have known a Persian sailor way back before the time of Christ had sailed around Africa, he'd gone from the Mediterranean Sea around Africa and came back up the Persian Gulf.
Excuse me.
Well, but they didn't know this. See, this was something we found out later. So Africa did come to an end, but but Portuguese sailors began to sail farther and farther and farther south. Bartholomew Diaz found the end of Africa. It was the Cape of Good Hope, and he knew that once he saw the open ocean beyond the Cape of Good Hope, that he had found the end of the continent of Africa. But his sailors said, no, we're not going to sail any farther. Yes?
What edition of the book do we need?
8th. Hey, okay, I'm glad you asked that. I don't care if it's a 7th, 6th, 5th, 4th, as long as Dwyer Spielgel. It can be any edition at all, because he hasn't changed that much. Now, granted, what's now chapter 14 used to be chapter 13, but it's still the same stuff. Now, of course, if this were a computer class, you couldn't use last year's computer books. It changes that much every year. But this is a history class, and you can use history books that are 10 years old, as long as it's Dwyer Spielgel, because different authors emphasize different things. But these authors start off with chapter 14 with the Portuguese sailors. Now, Vasco da Gama loaded up a ship, and he sailed all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, and he went to India. He offloaded India. The people of India welcomed him. It was the first time a Portuguese ship had ever landed there in India. He found some Christian people, European people there waiting for him also. These sailors came on a dirty, ragged ship. They were suffering from scurvy, a disease brought on by lack of vitamin C. Nobody would ever have guessed that these dirty, ragged sailors in a dirty, ragged ship would someday conquer India. Actually, the Europeans, not the Portuguese, the Europeans eventually conquered India. Nobody would ever have guessed it. The prince who encouraged travel was Henry the Navigator. Henry the Navigator was the 4th son of King John of Portugal, so he never got to be king. His older brother, King John II, got to be king. But Henry didn't, because he was too far back of the line. But he encouraged travel. Keep Henry in mind. I'll have a little more to say about him later. Henry the Navigator collected all the maps and globes that he could find, and yes, I said globes. The Portuguese had no doubt that the world was round. In fact, the idea that people did not know in those days the earth was round, it was flat, that is a myth. every educated European knew the earth was round. And Henry, now, something else about Henry the Navigator's maps, and we don't know how, some of his maps actually had the North and South American continents on them. And some of them actually had the continent of Antarctica. Antarctica is the only continent that has a river that runs from one ocean to the other, that splits the whole continent in two. And today it's under 3 miles of ice. How did those people know that? That's another topic all to itself. But anyway, Henry the Navigator collected everything he could and encourages people to go west. All right, now we shift from Portugal to Spain. We start off our story with Spain with Columbus. All right, the standard view, folk, that Columbus was a poor boy born in the country of Genoa. Genoa was a city-state in Italy, and Italy had a lot of city-states. Columbus was Genoese. He had 2 brothers, one named Bartholomew and one named Diaz. I don't doubt the part about the 2 brothers. He also had an illegitimate son, maybe more than one illegitimate child by a woman he would not marry. And people wondered, why didn't he marry that woman? Well, when he finally married, he married an adopted daughter of Henry the Navigator. Basically, he married into royalty. That does not fit what you'd call a poor person. I mean, Columbus went before kings. He went to the King of Portugal first, then he went to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. Yes, there were 2 of them. Queen Isabella had inherited her land, and King Ferdinand inherited his kingdom, and they married. But Isabella, keep on, Isabella's kingdom was bigger than her husband's. That meant that she could rule the roost. Anyway, that's another topic. But, yes. Now, the standard story that I was taught that in Columbus's day everybody believed the earth was flat, this is known not to be true. Everybody believed the earth was round. Columbus, it is true though, that he believed that he could reach China by not going around Africa, but by sailing straight west across the Atlantic. Now, what your book says, he miscalculated the earth. He believed the earth was only 15,000 miles. He probably was no mathematician. Most of the people of his day believed the earth was much bigger. Anyway, when Columbus went to the King of Portugal first, keep in mind he was distantly related to the King of Portugal through his wife. When he went to the King of Portugal, the King of Portugal secretly sent a sailing vessel out in the Atlantic a ways, and that vessel turned around and said, "Your Majesty, there's no land out there." When Columbus found out about this, he was very angry, and he huffed and puffed and went to the King of Spain. He asked for some ships to sail across the Atlantic. King Ferdinand consulted with the doctors at his university. Yes, in those days, even the kings, just like today, they had state schools, so he had a university, and this university had scholars. The scholars told him, yes, the earth is round, but it's so far to China that any crew you send will perish for lack of, you can't carry enough food, you can't carry enough water, the ships would sink. We just simply can't go that way because it would take too long and require too much food and water. So Ferdinand would not sponsor it. Isabella was not interested at first. Columbus got on his horse and started to head for the King of France, hoping to get some help from the King of France. I mean, this is an old story. But, all right, Isabella had on her staff, her treasurer was a Jew who had converted voluntarily to Christianity. This treasurer said, "Your Majesty, I will pay for the ships out of my own pocket, so nothing will come to the royal treasury. But I am interested in what Columbus is saying." So Isabella sent a man on a fast horse to overtake Columbus and bring him back. Keep in mind, her kingdom was bigger than her husband's, so she could give 3 ships if she wanted to. Ferdinand and Isabella were stopped by a war going on. They had to drive the Muslims out of Spain, but felt they had to. In August of 1492, all the last of the Muslims were driven out of Spain. And Ferdinand and Isabella were free to think of something else. Anyway, Isabella gave Columbus 3 old ships. Now, folks, this is a sad part of the story. The men who crewed Columbus's ships were not the best that Europe had to offer. They were jailbirds, whom Isabella said, I'll pardon you, I'll free you if you go on Columbus's ship. So these jailbirds, some of them took her up on it. You know, they were not the best of men. One of them was an 11-year-old boy even. Anyway, Columbus sailed west. On October 12th, he sighted land. This is an old story. He met the Indians. They were friendly at first. Looked like things would be peaceful. But one night, he had this 11-year-old boy at the helm of his big ship, the Santa Maria. The 11-year-old boy got the ship to the place where 2 seas met, at the corner of the island, you might say, and he couldn't handle the currents. Ran the Santa Maria aground and dashed the Santa Maria to pieces. Bad news. Columbus was only able to return in 2 ships, so he left a bunch of his men there on the island of Hispaniola. He took 7 of the Indians with him, and he got Ferdinand excited and Isabella excited. He told what all he'd seen. The Indians there wore gold. Now, of course, he said they also were very, very unclothed. Some of them